As I was living abroad, this book helped me get from a B1 to a B2 in my target language in just 4 weeks. I'm going to give you the 9 principles that I applied in order to accomplish this really intense project. Now, before I go into Scott Young's book, Ultralearning, I want to give a few caveats because this book is centered around really intense, self-directed learning projects within a short amount of time only. So that means it's not immediately applicable to everyone's lives. This type of learning that Young is addressing here takes an extreme amount of energy. Take it from me because I was pretty burned out by the end of finishing this project, actually. So be inspired by one concept, one principle that really sticks out to you, rather than trying to follow all these steps exactly. If you aren't in a similar situation like mine, where I could just go abroad for a few months and really focus primarily on language learning. Okay, so now that we've got that out of the way, the 9 principles are meta-learning, focus, directness, drill, retrieval, feedback, retention, intuition, and experimentation. So let's discuss this first principle, meta-learning, where we're first mapping out what exactly we are doing for this project coming up. According to this principle, before you learn anything, it's first important to understand what you need to learn and how best to learn it. So think about the why, the what, and the how. Why are you learning this language? What should you learn? And how should you learn it? And this could be, before even touching a language, identifying the kind of vocabulary, the grammar that you need, what your pronunciation will be like, the cultural context you're learning about, etc. For my example, I wanted to reach B2 in Turkish. I knew my purpose for learning it, which turned out to be I was fascinated by the connection in between Turkish-speaking Germans and Germans themselves when I was abroad in Dortmund. I determined I needed a course in order to get me to B2, and it would also get me talking about harder topics with longer sentences on a consistent basis. So that's why I also wanted a class in person instead of online, when I could just easily very much skip the online class. I also wanted someone else to organize my materials for me, and going to a course in person or online is a good way for you to have them do that work for you. The next principle is sharpen your knife. So this is the principle where you master your attention and you cultivate your ability to concentrate. You eliminate your distractions and you structure your time for maximum output. So Scott Young gives examples like using the Pomodoro method or designing your environment a certain way, aka maybe studying in the same place for your language learning every day, and or using and building in different habits throughout your day. He also really emphasizes that deep focus is a skill that you can train. And this is exactly what I did. I went to Istanbul. I showed up absolutely every single day, not skipping class. So my brain actually associated the class environment as that automatic sign for, okay, Emily, you're here to study, turn on your learning brain. I had a class that would hold me accountable for studying every day and motivating me to work on the language, both actively and passively inside and outside of class. And I structured my time every day to always have room for having an extra conversation class for about 30 minutes, maybe on italki with my teacher, so that I could implement some of the principles, talk about them in Turkish, and then go to my class directly after that in the afternoon. That way I could further solidify my knowledge and get even more comfortable in different harder topics for B2. The next principle is directness, aka learning the thing that you actually want to get good at. And this is where Scott Young emphasizes to avoid overly abstract or passive learning. Avoid doing tasks that take you away from that main goal, aka studying even more vocabulary, trying to write even more, when what you actually want to do is start speaking your language. He says not to replace active tasks with passive learning, just because those may seem more convenient or more comfortable for us. Now, this can be a block for language learners, especially for speaking. So make sure to sign up for my waitlist for the Speak Your Language with Confidence Challenge if you desire that deeper and more personalized support and build up that solo speaking habit without the emotional and mental hurdles that you might be facing. So back to our directness principle. When I was learning Turkish from B1 to B2, I specifically wanted to speak it and be able to converse for a whole day in Turkish with a friend if needed, without any use of English, without too much struggle on my part, and with relative fluency. Plus, I knew that working on all skills of speaking, writing, reading, and listening would help me get there. Again, this is why I wanted a class to help me structure when and how I would work on all of those skills and under what topics I would use them. And with speaking specifically, class really helped me with getting out of my comfort zone really fast. past. I had to talk about really hard topics in front of others that I really didn't feel prepared to talk about. I didn't divert my attention to wanting to be able to speak with trying to memorize more vocabulary so that I would feel more prepared, simply because it was more convenient, more comfortable. Yes, I did do a little bit of passive learning for vocabulary, but then immediately got to apply it in an active sense in my class, which then got me uncomfortable, which then sped up progress. The next principle is drill. So here you're basically attacking your weakest point in your language learning. And this is where you can really break your skills down and isolate those difficulties for yourself, and then create targeted practices to increase your fluency and your precision in that area. For example, if you struggle with pronunciation in French, you would isolate the sounds for practice. So an example of one of my weakest points in Turkish was sticking to short sentences, because in Turkish, I'm basically learning the exact opposite grammar structure from English. I mean, everything is backwards. So that's why I was really scared of not being able to think backwards essentially in a language fluently. And so I just kept on avoiding what I actually wanted to do. Plus, I stuck with topics that I was more comfortable to speak about. This is why I chose to go to class. So again, I got to drill all of this in class and outside of class, plus actively use the same grammar and the vocabulary, both in writing and speaking and output. The next principle is retrieval, testing to recall information, not just rereading it or reviewing it. Young states that learning actively is much more effective than learning passively. And I really like this point that he emphasizes. Testing isn't simply a way of assessing knowledge, but a way to create it. So test yourself before you feel confident, and push yourself to actively recall information rather than only passively reviewing it. Because he says retrieval practice is an act of pulling information out of your memory rather than just putting it in via reading, listening, comprehensible input. When you quiz yourself, when you write what you remember, or even when you just mentally recall ideas, you are essentially training your brain to retrieve that knowledge more reliably, more consistently, faster in the future. Young even cites research, like the testing effect, which shows that students who self-test perform better than those who just reread or highlight their notes, even if they study for the same amount of time. Passive review feels productive. You're reading, highlighting, reviewing, but the gains are often illusionary. You feel like you're learning, but the knowledge doesn't stick. And he emphasizes that retrieving does feel very uncomfortable, but that is why it works. You have to stress your memory for it to grow stronger. So reviewing might look like reading notes or rereading textbooks, re-watching lectures. Retrieving information, on the other hand, might look like flashcards, doing practice problems, trying to write down what you remember without looking, etc. And my example of this is whenever I do something in a textbook, I don't necessarily write down my answer first. I will, without looking at any of the grammar exercises in advance, read as spontaneously as possible, and then fill in the blank what I think in the moment is the right answer. That is active retrieval. Now again, writing down your answer is also active retrieval, but if you have to mentally think about it in your head, you're training your brain to actively retrieve even faster than if you were writing. And again, I was essentially doing these grammar exercises in order to solidify a new concept. So even though I didn't say the right answer all the time, still the act of trying to retrieve that information made my memory grow stronger. So don't wait to feel fully ready before you test yourself. I also like to use the blank page recall method, where you basically close all of your notes at the end of the day and you try to basically do a brain dump of everything you felt like you learned during the lesson right after. And again, all of these principles are based on this person who is implementing all of these principles as having really high energy and lots of focus, lots of time. There is really nothing wrong with choosing passive review over active recall in some of your study sessions, especially if you are low energy that day, or if you just don't have time to devote to language learning full time. Whatever helps you operate at your maximum capacity in your language learning is worth your time and valid to do so. So no hate on the passive review. What do you want to include more of long term that respects your energy but also gets you where you would like to go in your language learning progress? The next principle is feedback. So you learn from criticism and you seek out real, immediate, and according to Young, sometimes harsh feedback on your skills. He gives 3 types of feedback here. So outcome, informational, and corrective. And he emphasizes to use this feedback for improvement and not for discouraging ourselves. Again, and this is easier said than done, criticism coming from another person or from ourselves in our language can be a huge barrier against actually gaining the fluency confidence that we crave, and really against implementing effectively any of these principles outlined in this book. I love coaching language learners to help them get unstuck, plus save them tons of time and energy, getting them faster to their own language goals. So you're free to book a discovery call below if any of that is resonating for you, to see if we would be a good fit to work together. So back to what Young quotes about receiving feedback. He says that people often avoid feedback because it's painful. Ultra learners seek it because it works. I would also emphasize though that during this part of the book, I thought about how much less emphasis is put on the kind of quality teachers, mentors, coaches that really help with your learning process, right? If you don't have a high quality teacher, or if you have a teacher that makes you feel discouraged, that part is going to impede you just as much. So access to really good quality instruction who provide quality feedback is also essential to implementing successfully this principle. The next principle is retention, and this is the principle where you essentially develop systems in order to help your brain memorize things over the longer term. And this is where you can use spaced repetition with Anki or Quizlet and any other similar review systems. But he does emphasize here, just as focus is trainable, memory is also trainable. For example, some of my best long-term systems in order to help develop and maintain my memory is recording all of the words I don't know from my textbook in class into my physical notebook, and also my flashcard digital set on Quizlet. Now I usually set aside an hour per day in order to just review vocabulary. And what this usually looks like is I passively review what's in my physical notebook and I actively recall what is in my digital flashcard set. And that is to just essentially balance out my energy for the day. The next principle is intuition, which Scott says is using play and exploration of concepts. Basically, you don't rely on memorization in order to try to learn things. An example of doing this would be using comprehensible input to internalize words, vocabulary, grammar, expressions in context, so that you can better deeply understand each concept instead of just trying to memorize everything as one single concept on its own. Intuition is built by playing with ideas. I tend to do a lot of the chunking method, which is a way to build intuition and exploration of different concepts I need for learning Turkish and reaching B2. And I do this chunking method via flashcards. But I also like to write my own sentences using the same vocabulary and grammar structures in my writing and my speaking. For example, you can say, before I do this and this and this in Turkish in several ways. Before I actually went to my intensive in-person class, I only knew how to express this one way in Turkish, which was, if I wanted to say, before I come, gelmeden önce was the only way that I knew how to express this. Well, in my in-person class, I learned a new way, geleceğim zaman, which means the exact same thing, but you're actually using some of the future tense in order to express something before, which is kind of weird. But I would have never understood that if I didn't go to class, and I would have never internalized and really understood how that concept works if I didn't immediately try to employ it in my speaking and in my writing right after learning it. So that is where a lot of the experimentation and play came from in order to implement this one grammar concept through producing more output in my language learning. The next principle is experimentation. Basically, go outside your comfort zone. And here, Young emphasizes to try new methods and be willing to fail in order to find out what works best. This is where you really embrace the trial and error of language learning. You listen to yourself, you tweak your learning strategies, and your results will improve. This could be looking like changing your study schedule if you find something isn't working, changing your materials, maybe your approach, until you notice what accelerates your progress the best. So my example is that I did the big thing and moved to a whole new country. So that was way out of my comfort zone. However, for you, it doesn't have to look so big in order to do essentially the same thing, right? There are many effective ways to get out of the comfort zone. And it's important to find what works for you and what is actually accessible for you in your life and your life circumstances in this moment. I will add a caveat to this. I usually recommend thinking about going out of the comfort zone as gently stretching the edges of your comfort zone instead of just jumping way outside of it. Because if we do that, we run the risk of overwhelming ourselves and then retreating way back into our comfort zone and feeling like we haven't made progress. And this can look like maybe a really shy person having the goal of speaking in their target language to a native speaker, but they go from 0 to 100, aka they go from not speaking to anyone to automatically speaking with a stranger in public. And even though that's outside of the comfort zone, they find themselves retreating even further back after that interaction feeling that they did super bad and that they just don't want to do it again. So in that case, I would have suggested to gently work yourself up to that point that you want. There are ways to manufacture our learning environment so that we do feel safe still, but that still get us uncomfortable. In contrast to this shy person who probably does not feel safe automatically going up to some random person in a unfamiliar place, that probably feels both unsafe and uncomfortable for them. So if we can build that safety, which is again what I like to help and coach language learners on doing in my Speak Your Language with Confidence challenge below, that is way more highly effective long-term and a lot better for helping us maintain healthy mindsets in our learning. I want to remind all of us, this book is highly based on super fast productivity with high dedication, high energy, and a high time commitment. And remember, not all of us might be at a point in life where we can devote this much time and energy to a project. This is a privilege that I have gotten after 6 years of not having it, okay? So actually getting to move to a different country and all of my life, not have any responsibilities to anyone else. Don't beat yourself up if you can't follow and apply all of these principles. Pick just one of the principles to apply and see what shifts it might bring about. But overall, I do recommend this book. It helped me identify some of my quote unquote blind spots that I felt was blocking me in my learning. Write me down below what principle you found the most helpful from this video, and I'll see you in another video next time.